the removal of this mature stand of trees that we're talking about then contradict that particular section of the zoning ordinance?
We are permitted to disturb up to 50% of any secondary resource based on the code.
You're familiar with the Planning Commission's recommendation that the easternmost access onto West Pleasant Grove Road, that right now it's proposed to be directly across from Hidden Pond Way. The Planning Commission wanted that to be relocated to be more in the location of a connector road. Are you familiar with that condition?
Yes.
And would they be willing to consider that or investigate relocation of that easternmost access?
I believe that they will.
The Planning Commission and the Township's traffic consultant, Al Federico, recommended that the access that you have on Exhibit A3 that leads to Route 202, that be eliminated. Is Toll willing to comply with that condition?
Yes.
You talked about a proposed emergency access road from the development to New Street. How wide is that proposed emergency road?
It is about 15 feet wide.
Are you familiar with the fact that the largest apparatus used by the Fame Fire Company is 44 feet 7 inches, and the wheelbase is 245 inches and has a height of 12 feet?
I just recently became aware of that based on the letter.
And is the emergency access road designed to accommodate that type of vehicle?
I can't answer that, but we can accommodate for that if need be.
What improvements is Toll proposing to make to that emergency access road?
We haven't gotten into that detail yet. During the land development process, we can design that to accommodate emergency access vehicles.
And it would be something that, as part of the development, Toll would make those improvements so that it would be available for use by emergency vehicles as soon as the development was opened?
Yeah, if the township sees that the emergency accesses are needed and they want them, we can provide for them.
And how does the township assure that that access road will be properly maintained so that in years in the future it can be used by emergency vehicles?
It would be owned and maintained by the HOA.
Would there be some sort of condition or restriction within the HOA covenants that would require them to do sort of annual inspections to make sure that the emergency road is being properly maintained?
Yes.
I'm going to object. I think that's beyond the scope of her grant.
Okay. Well, she did talk about emergency access road. I'm just getting into the purpose of that.
The HOA documents and ownership and maintenance are beyond the scope of her grant.
Well, to the extent she can explain how Toll typically handles emergency access roads, I don't think it's too far beyond her scope. What was the thought process of Toll in not providing any access onto New Street?
We were trying to maintain a visual corridor along that street.
Focusing on the plan sheet, so again, Exhibit A3, Sheet 3E of the plan shows the primary conservation areas. Can you explain, I was a little confused with your testimony about what is being proposed as far as disturbance in the primary conservation areas.
This plan, sheet 3A.
3E is what I was referring to, I'm sorry.
Shows areas that we're proposing disturbance of secondary resources and of limited primary resources such as wetland crossings to gain access to the developable areas of the site.
So just so I'm clear, the disturbance to primary conservation areas is limited to wetlands for purposes of crossings?
Correct.
Okay. And then I guess this sheet also shows areas of secondary conservation areas.
Yes.
What in those areas is being disturbed, specifically?
Sorry, what was the question?
I was a little confused with your testimony on what specifically is being disturbed in what is identified on this sheet as secondary conservation areas.
precautionary slope areas. They're noted in several locations due to road grading.
And precautionary slopes are what percentage? Is it
50.
15 to 25?
Correct.
Okay. Is anything on the property greater than 25% slope?
Yeah, we have a small amount of area that's 25% and greater. They're shown on the existing features plan on sheet 3.
And are any of those slopes that are greater than 25% grade proposed to be disturbed?
No.
You stated in your testimony that there are specimen trees greater than 18 inches in diameter have been surveyed and are shown in the limit of disturbance.
Correct.
And which specimen trees, are there any that are of, great significance that you would prefer not, or that you would suggest the toll not remove because of their significance or size?
Once we get into fine-tune grading, there may be one or two we can save. I don't think there's any that are worth saving over, a significant chunk of woodlands or, another resource.
There's nothing that really stands out as far as a specimen tree that you feel is really worthy of preservation?
No.
Sheet 4C of Exhibit A3 was an open space plan. Would you agree with me that the open space areas don't provide a large amount of contiguous land? There's sort of like little swatches throughout. There's not really any large area of contiguous open space.
I think a majority of it is contiguous.
Well, let me look at sheet 4. Well, I should say it this way. The open space areas that are on 4C that are not otherwise disturbed with infiltration areas and effluent disposal areas, are those areas large contiguous areas?
Yes.
And how will those areas, will they be left in a natural state, or will they be used by the HOA for development for recreational purposes?
The areas highlighted with the plus hatch are going to be preservation areas, which will not be disturbed.
So the 93 acres that have the little
Correct.
process? Okay. There's a pond on the property. Will that be preserved?
Yes.
And that will be conveyed to the HOA?
It will be a part of the open space for the HOA.
On the same sheet, you have identified natural areas, the proposed natural areas of 93 acres. Will those 93 acres be deed restricted to prohibit any further disturbance?
I believe they will.
How did toll arrive at the unit mix between the single-family dwellings and the carriage homes?
We tried to maximize the single-family lots and reach the yield of 319, which is the permitted density.
And will that unit mix change at all based on market conditions? Or could it, I guess?
I believe it could.
Okay. Have you received and reviewed the Chester County Planning Commission review letter, which was dated December 7th, 2016, and has been marked as Exhibit B12?
What was that again?
Are you familiar with the County Planning Commission review letter of December 7th?
Right, yes.
Okay. And in that, the County Planning Commission recommended that Toll consider a revised site plan in which the development activity is located to the greatest extent on the eastern portion of the site. Are you familiar with that recommendation of the County Planning?
the site.
I'm just asking if you're familiar with the County Planning Commission's recommendation to shift more of the development activity further east towards Route 202.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And if that were to occur, wouldn't that provide a larger area closer to New Street, as in its natural state, left preserved?
Yes, there are a number of ways that the property could be slightly reconfigured.
And that would also be consistent with the Planning Commission's recommendation that the area that the county identifies as the Brandywine Battlefield swath be preserved.
Partially.
Okay, so is that something that Toll would consider, shifting more development to the east?
I would have to defer to Toll on that.
The County Planning Commission also recommended that applicant consider providing more townhouse lots or carriage house lots and fewer single families, because that would promote more clustering and potentially more open space, and also allow the goal of shifting the development to the east. Is that something that Toll would consider?
I believe that would be a question for Andrew.
The plans that you presented do not provide any trail connections to adjacent properties or adjacent trails. Is that correct?
We are assuming that pedestrians would also use the sidewalks located on our streets, and Road L provides a sidewalk up through to Hidden Pond Way, which could connect to the trail adjacent across the street.
What about connections into Thornbury Township? Would you propose any for that?
We do not have any proposed at this time.
Would you consider doing that?
That would be a question for Toll.
Are you familiar with the township's comprehensive plan and open space plan, which proposes a perimeter public trail?
I am aware of that.
And you're also aware of the Planning Commission's recommendation that the plans be revised to provide a perimeter trail?
I'm aware of that.
And why was not a perimeter trail proposed on the conditional use plans?
We were trying to preserve views from the outside site and not propose disturbance to these areas, because there's a lot of floodplain woodlands along the southern portion of the site that I don't think would be conducive to trails.
So Toll is still objecting to placing perimeter trail around this property?
I'm not saying that, but I would just state my opinion.
In your testimony, you suggested that some of the trails, well, that all of the trails are proposed to be dedicated to the HOA, but that Toll would discuss possible transfer of some trails to the township. Have you had any further dialogue as to what proposed trails would be dedicated for public use or could be dedicated for public use?
I have not been involved if there is any conversations.
Okay, so we haven't gone to that yet. You touched briefly in your testimony on screening, and you said that a landscape plan had been submitted. Can you go into a little bit more detail about what type of screening, if you're at that level yet, what type of screening, if any, is proposed along West Pleasant Grove Road?
We're proposing a berm and landscape buffer behind the townhome lots along West Pleasant Grove Road. This consists of a mixture of evergreens, shade trees, and understory trees to help screen the views from our site to the road and from the neighbors to our site.
Is there any berm involved in that landscaping plan?
We aren't showing one, but we could provide one.
The Planning Commission had a recommendation, it was condition 44, that the applicant shall add a landscape berm along West Pleasant Grove Road from Hidden Pond Way to a point approximately 350 feet west of Dunvegan Road. Is that something that Toll would consider?
I believe so.
Is any landscaping or buffering proposed between the Toll property and the property owned by Mr. Masharis?
Yes, we are.
Do you intend to preserve the existing trees along the property boundary with the Masharis property?
That is the intent.
What is the width of the proposed streets?
25 feet.
And is it your intention that these streets be dedicated to the township?
I believe they're going to be offered up for dedication.
Are these streets wide enough to accommodate on-street parking?
No.
Where does Toll propose overflow parking for residents in instances where the homeowners have large events or parties at their home?
We have driveway parking.
Is that sufficient for large parties such as a Super Bowl party when you have many guests?
We could provide additional off-street parking. We haven't gotten into that level of detail yet, but we can provide additional off-street parking.
After some of your developments are designed and built out, are you familiar with existing residents of Toll developments complaining about lack of parking for those types of events?
Not personally, I've not heard any.
I think it was just one of the recommendations that there be other, McCormick Taylor's letter, which was dated March 23rd, 2017, recommended that you identify more areas for overflow parking. Is that something Toll's willing to do?
Yes, I believe so.
And is the proposal to have sidewalks on one side of the street or both?
We haven't gotten to that level of detail yet, but there will be sidewalks.
Does Toll have a preference for one side or both?
Typically, we do one side.
Section 170-407 of the ordinance requires a 75-foot setback from perennial streams.
Correct.
Do the conditional use plans comply with that requirement?
Yes.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Camp. Next on my list was Birmingham Township from Crawford, who I do not believe is here this evening. Next would be Thornbury Township. Ms. Labram, do you have any questions for this witness? Thank you. No questions from Ms. Labram. Mr. Thompson for Neighbors for Crebilly. Any questions for the witness? Do not. Thank you. Brandywine at Thornbury. Mr. Dufault, are you here? Do you have any questions for this witness? Radley Run 3 HOA, John Bertinetti. Mr. Bertinetti, do you have any questions for this witness? Hang on a second. I need to get your name, and if you wouldn't mind speaking in the microphone, because I'm not sure who you are.
My name is Tom Martin. I signed the application for the standards.
You got to get right up to that microphone.
Tom Martin is my name. I